Sam Edwards about his dad. His name was Emmet, though he'd have liked it with 2 T's, like Emmet Dalton of the Dalton Boys, who lived to make a movie in the American way of repentance, with out-of-focus bucking horses and old-timers with bandanas, old-timers with wide-winged chaps, deep bucket hats of an earlier West. We liked looking back then, not like now, over your shoulder, turned. I used to trick my dad into last week's Elko shows held over, endlessly reeling out the last gun battles in black and white, reels sputtering, ranch hands too broke for the bars, where loners might differ. My dad was the master of the sigh and the warbled groan and the undertone expletives. You know, it was something like poochie. And the beer would erupt in a breathy blast. He grew up in California when there were no effete estates in vines. In the Santa Ynez Valley, now traveled by gleaming symbols of middle-class might and minutes, where at 18 it took my dad a couple of weeks, poochie, to herd cows from Santa Ynez to summer on Figueroa Mountain. Proof of the throbbing of this earth still only partially plundered, and only an indigenous few had been displaced.
How did you know Emmet Edwards?
I was the cow boss for the 25 ranch, and so he bought cattle from the 25 ranch, and we got to be great friends, Bobby and him, his wife, and they were very, very sweet people. And when he died, he left me his saddle.
As a very little boy, I sat in wonder at the livery stable. Enormous to me from my horizon, the smell of hay and leather then like backhoes and oil to boys now, on an Anacapa street on Mall, while my dad dickered with the man who planted the giant fig at the Southern Pacific Station, where he'd look the other way as I put $1 still heavy with silver on the hot gleaming tracks, poochie, just before the daylight steamed by, gorgeous in orange and yellow, beating time for the continent along the road of tears. You could drive to your room in San Luis, if your Model T with its craftsman's paint job baked by the sunset to a Mediterranean hue could pass the Paso Robles bars. Thanksgiving was prawns in Bakersfield, a relief from bachelor biscuits, hard as cud, but a bigger loss of expectations to a 6-year-old than a dad's inebriated loss of balance. This dickering, always camouflaged in laughs like tanks covered in leaves, with ranchers on horseback, way before dawn, hot breath of cow pony with horsehair hackamore, as it's always been done, roan or bay, long-maned and cranky, creak of saddling and poochie, the good taste of hot black coffee, left with grounds tasty to boys longing to be men. Maybe those ranchers' daddies or granddaddies, hardened by 2,000 miles of trail, had put their heads together to rid this vast, rich country of coyotes, wolves, bear, cougar, forest forever, mountains without radar, not to mention the peoples of a troubling past. To forfeit continuity in grandsons and daughters for Friday night cash. Without horses that buck, fences to fix, legs that break, all-night rides with the late show of gods big and lonesome, searching for your soul and lost yearnings in Manzanita, just in time for Geronimo to make it to the silver screen as a hero. My daddy, who never owned a darn thing but hat, saddle, utilitarian chaps, bridle, and spurs, the ornamentation was in the mischievous eyes. A boy, always. I think he was as afraid of capital acquisition as he was of a long life, for he was mortally spooked by the development on his beloved land of things that don't belong. For my dad shared rootedness with earlier people, forged to the molten core of an earth already perfect. Maybe that is why he had so many friends and no acquaintances at all. Maybe that is why he could speak just enough Mexican, Basque, and several Indian tongues so that he could break bread and laugh in the language of the West, where, and don't forget when, men still looked each other in the eye. For my dad always hired Oahe cowboys and did what you should never do back then, when he shared his pint. Perhaps that is why at his wake no crying there, Poochie. Broke cowpokes and merchant prince ranchers, but absolutely no wide-brimmed drugstore cowboys. Just the real deal. Dressed pretty much alike, in starched Levi's and white shirts from all over their West. Perhaps they too had remembered this love of place and space. Perhaps this was part of Sitting Bull's mission to pass on to his tormentors, bushwhackers, red and white, the broken heart way, so that old cowboys, hiding from the pain, could practice their death songs in the out-of-the-way bars, safe from the bulldozers that have took the wild out of the West. Perhaps that is why my dad drank. Though that's not what his wives said. They had behind them a continuing line of tumble-down ranches in places like Death, Mitcham, Tuscarora, and Jigs. For later, when there was less headroom in California and no open range herds unless the breath of Santana and El Nino tangled the wire for a week or two, he drifted to Nevada, mistaking it for nirvana, where it took 100 acres for a cow to graze into steak. He arrived unnoticed with Bing Crosby and a bevy of Magnum owners who flew in on private DC-3s for round-up barbecues and 1 million acres of write-off. Like his wives, California had come with him.
Emmet had a lot of the same traits like all those guys did that were raised with the Californians. They had their own way of mastering horses, and they were great cattle hands. I had the fortune of being around them a lot.
In Nevada, I would be sent to look for him, passed out amongst itinerant hay hands with names like Tiny and Heavy on the floor of places like the Pioneer, across the street from the Commercial. But when sober, which could happen for weeks at a time, and once even for years, my dad could tell a story so that the most contrary, unembellished, saddle-sore cowhand was roped and tied, and certainly even his son, who was too dumb to find the art in shaking a loop like him, was spellbound by words and gestures and voices of the past found in expressions and impressions and tears of delight. Poochie. The raconteur of the West, lost artist of North America, worked his magic with any audience of a few, and any place would do. I'm told best by a fire, as he used his art to tease taciturn men to their lighter sides. At the counter of June's, the Stockmans, and coffee shops across the West, where the folks who made things happen found an occasion to dicker after a pre-dawn turn in the saddle. I figured he knew waitresses, the way townies knew their wives. Perhaps that is why the last wife in his string sprang him with cheerful malice from the drunk tank in Livermore. The last time I saw him was in Livermore, in one of those old high-ceiling California Chinese restaurants with descendants of worked-to-death Sierra Rail gangs there in Livermore, rendering retribution in chop suey. I remember as a very small boy, as my littlest now follows me, with my dad on the old Alisal Ranch before it had a world-class restaurant and a golf course. I saw an old black and white photo of him doing rope tricks by the corral across the river from the main house.
Yeah, he team roped like a lot of the Californians did. Mm-hmm. But not professionally. It was always like amateur, and what a lot of these ranches would have little rodeos all through the times, and just cowboys, that's all. And of course, Emmet was a good cowboy.
But I never knew him then. Really good at his craft. But I do remember us in a meadow. I was scooched up on the pommel. He rode Mexican then, overly carved and too quickly tanned. I remember the vaqueros all still wore sombreros, but the old line California ranches were still Spanish land grant or principled by caretakers of a lineage that meant something to those who cared, never imagining San Jose's rich soil paved entire. Later, on Nevada BLM land, he was just at home in the last of the itinerant cowboy life, there on the throwback grape ranches, prospering on borrowed government land. He was not tempted by the lure of the casinos or even the dealerettes. In little towns like Mountain City, propped in ancient cuneiform hills, pungent with the sweet sage smell of afternoon thunderstorms, with more bars than houses. He was not tempted when out with a wagon in landscapes we can now only recollect, and where he was the clipper captain of his own destiny.
And Emmet was one that when you started gathering him out of the field to truck, Emmet would never go in the car and mind his own business. He'd come along to make sure you weren't putting in other cattle. Because he had worked them the day before and had them all straightened up, but he always figured that cattle people might slip a few bad ones in. And that was the biggest one. He'd always go with the drives when we'd come in. Not on the, we used to come about 70 miles from the north with the cattle. He wouldn't be with them then, but he'd be there at shipping days.
He would come with cowboys from 100 miles in gray first-run power wagons and 1947 red short-bed trucks, the splintery decks awash in cans of grease, barbed wire, and fence posts, to dances at Jack's Creek, where he drank with a shout and dodged the fights. The whooping, prancing, musical melees of these men for bow-legged cowboys rarely could dance. In just a few more years would be the market of field study by French anthropologists. Proper branding and goodwill having had their day in the fenced-in states, barbed wire now would project inalienable rights, indivisible to the horizon. When he was in his canvas teepee tent, he didn't have to measure himself against the self-serving table manners of pallid men whose sheen pool no longer included a love of outside work made possible by strong hands. He was adrift and floundering in the conversation of capital gains, write-offs, and inheritance taxes. He could not be of a mind that did not include a world of critters and solitude and the rhythm of day-to-day ordinary things done well. Poochie. Of the few photos gorgeous in the black and white of memory, I have none. But if not the content, I remember well the way of the stories he told, of the trails he rode, and mostly the folks he knowed through a West perhaps damned and sold, but still vibrant with soul. For in the old days we were still a family, with a family's dark secret or two, and the 4th of July rodeo was bigger than Christmas. Of the few objects to be divided when he died all those years ago, in the assassin's year, and maybe the West too, when John Wayne didn't look saddle sore anymore. My dad's silver-buckled saddle-tool belt and his cowhand's wattling knife came to me. I did not deserve to know where his saddle went. Shortly before he died, of a broken heart and a trail-weary liver, having survived the crossing of the deep river of Jim Beam. There were 2 wakes, one for his new Nevada friends and one for the ghosts of California's past where he'd spent a lifetime of mischief. With my uncle, a living company spook mentioned in passing in a book or two of the Gordian knot of November 22, we carried his body bag, still elastic with life, having just passed by. We carried him from the Cessna at the San Ynez Airport, there at the railhead had been, of the narrow gauge steam train that had started him on his way to a Berkeley that still had farms.
He had probably one of the finest reputations of anybody that was ever buying cattle. He was honest, very strict, worked the cattle pretty thin, but he was so widely known. Emmet was one of the most, and honest. That was the big thing about Emmet, was honest, you know, and that's quite a neat thing for a cowman.
Many young cowboys at the Ballard Wake told me about my dad bringing them to Nevada on the last of the old days for their first saddle jobs, so that the old ways could continue. And they sure did what I'd forgot, and what has taken me a lifetime to remember. But at least I now have a son named Emmet, notice the 2 T's, and 2 more who are not afraid to learn what I am remembering now.